Good to meet you,
Good to
Qudsiya
meet
Naqui.
you too.
Thank you so
Yep.
much for being willing to come on this podcast show.
Yeah. And you can just call me Qudsiya. Naqui is my last name.
Qu-
Yeah.
Qudsiya Naqui. Okay,
Hmm.
so I'm going to read a quick bio and feel free to
Hmm.
correct anything that sounds incorrect, okay, after I read it. So we'll officially start then. Qudsiya Naqui is a blind civil rights lawyer, storyteller, and disability justice advocate. She's the creator and host of Down to the Struts, a podcast exploring disability, design, and intersectionality. Her work has been featured in Forbes, Vox, Oxford University Press, and the Disability Visibility Project. A fierce champion for accessibility, Qudsiya also organizes adaptive sports adventures with the Metro Washington Association of Blind Athletes. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and uses storytelling to uncover the building blocks of a more inclusive world. So, Qudsiya, feel free to tell us a little bit more about yourself as it pertains to this platform. It's disability advocacy, and feel free to correct anything that was incorrect in the bio.
Sure. I think the bio covers it pretty well. But yes, I live in Washington, D.C. I identify as being blind. I have a degenerative retinal condition that I've had since birth and have had a complex relationship with disability. I didn't always identify as blind or a disabled person until probably about 10 or so years ago. I grew up in suburban New Jersey and didn't have a lot of exposure to other disability community or to other blind community. I was in a mainstream school, and because my vision was so good when I was a child, I could read, print, and things like that. And so I was never introduced to Braille, never had a teacher of the visually impaired or TVI. So had, a pretty mainstream school experience. And it was only when I, really started to lose a lot of vision pretty rapidly in my mid 20s as I was beginning law school, that I started to really confront my disability. I slowly started to become more comfortable with using a white cane full time, which I didn't do previously. And I would often try to pass as sighted, which was really hard, especially when navigating school and relationships and employers. So yeah, I realized I really needed to use the cane for my safety. And then when I moved to Washington, D.C., I was introduced to another blind lawyer who I have really come to admire and who is someone I look up to. And that person, we had a shared interest in sports. And so she introduced me to the adaptive sports community. And that's really when I started meeting more blind and other types of disabled people. And in 2020, as the pandemic was breaking out and everyone was isolated at home, I was trying to think about something that I could do to help myself explore my own disability identity, but also contribute something to my community. And I've always loved podcasting. So that's how Down to the Struts was born as a disability focused podcast. It's an interview based show, and I interview disabled people and allies. Doing all sorts of work, whether that's law, public policy, the arts, entertainment, journalism, to help, as I mentioned in my tagline, uncover the building blocks for a more just, inclusive, and accessible world. And I feel so fortunate to have met so many incredible, interesting people through the podcast who have not only helped me grapple with, understand, appreciate, and embrace my own disability identity, but that I hope have helped to educate people about disability issues who may not be as familiar, and also serve as a place of community and a place of storytelling and shared experience for other disabled folks like myself.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for the very thorough addition to the bio. And so, is there an episode that personally moved you or surprised you that in ways that you didn't expect?
That's a tough one. There's so many episodes that have been really special to me over the years. I think that one that really moved me in particular came, I believe, at the end of the first season of the podcast, and the episode is called Walk World, WOC World, and I interviewed three blind women, Justice Shorter, Conchita Hernandez Legoretta, and Melissa Lomax, and they had just launched Walk World, which is a community for blind women of color, particularly younger blind women of color. So they wanted to focus on folks under 35. And it was an online community with a Facebook group, and they had done a few virtual events. And it was just such a beautiful experience for me to see these three leaders. They saw the need for this type of community, for mentorship, for being able to help each other out and creating a space of mutual aid. And they just went ahead and built it. And, I am a part of that community. And it was just a wonderful conversation that we all had together. And that was one that really stuck out to me. I also had the opportunity to interview the late, great Judy Heumann before she passed away. And that was a really special experience as well to hear about the disability rights movement from her perspective and hear, how she kind of helped build the coalition of people that make it possible for people like me to have access to all aspects of life.
Yeah, Judy has done some amazing work, and so have you. You're doing some amazing work too. I really appreciated how earlier you were talking about your background and how you really didn't have the exposure, the healthy exposure to the blind community and the resources, and normalizing those resources in that community. And through this podcast and through other work that you've been doing, it's normalizing and providing that kind of healthy, empowering information, right?
That's definitely true.
So my question following that is, have you ever changed your own beliefs because of something you've learned on the show so far?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to go back to that interview with Judy Heumann, actually. So, I am someone who, I've done a lot of legal scholarship and other type of scholarship, and I was really interested in disability studies, disability legal studies, thinking critically about disability and how it intersects with, things like race, and other things. And I remember in that interview with Judy, we were talking about these issues, and she said, these are all very important issues, but we also want to make sure that we don't make conversations about disability so esoteric and academic that the average person can't understand. Because, the way to be able to sort of shape hearts and minds is around ableism and other types of issues is to be able to talk to people in, sort of in a plain, simple way to explain to them why it's wrong to exclude and discriminate against and deny access to people with disabilities. And, that in some sense, like definitely made me think and challenge, some of my higher level academic interest in a way. But it also connected to something else, another theme that I've covered on the podcast with people like Amy Hamrai, who leads the critical design lab at Vanderbilt University, and others about, design and how taking a disability lens design helps us make the world more accessible for everyone. And one example that Amy and others have focused on a lot is this notion of plain language and being able to speak to people in clear terms without jargon. And I think that's in essence kind of what Judy was saying. We need to have these complex conversations about how disability intersects with all these issues and think about it and talk about how to break down those systemic problems. But we also need to make conversations about disability accessible to those who are not as familiar or who are having trouble understanding, why disabled life has value or, you know, why we should include people with disabilities in our society.
That's a great point. Yeah, about making the language more accessible. And even when people falter, whether they have a disability or don't have a disability, look more at the intent rather than, the surface stumble and fall. Um, And even the idiom I just used, stumble and fall, right? If someone, I some people might interpret it as ableist. I use a wheelchair because of polio and scoliosis. But the thing is, if we have to think about every single word and every single phrase and make ourselves feel so horrible about it, that's gonna defeat the purpose or just exhausting, quite honestly.
And also, just another point that I think Judy made and others have made, I just did an interview that's going to air soon that talks about this too, is if we talk in this grandiose and complicated way about disability and we make it sort of like this insider game, that really serves to exclude people who very well may have disabilities, but they don't necessarily identify as such. But they could still benefit from the community, from the legal protections, and all these other things. And so, if we talk about disability in kind of a more accessible, open way that is respectful of the fact that people are on it's a journey, right? And people are on a different part of that journey at different times in terms of whether they identify or not, whether they have internalized ableism sometimes or not. I mean, I certainly had those things and dealt with those things. And like, I couldn't even call myself blind for a lot of my young adult life. And so, we need to find a way to talk about disability in a way that includes those folks and makes them feel curious and and helps them to destigmatize their own experiences.
That's a great point. And we're going to segue right into that. So these next questions are about your identity and early experiences. Regarding on something you just said, actually. So when you were hiding your cane in college, what were you most afraid of people would assume about you? And were they right?
Mm, yeah, I think there was just a lot of shame I had associated with it because I just felt like once I take out this cane, number one, I'm going to draw all of this attention to myself that I don't want, which is true when you are a cane user or a user of any mobility device or any kind of visible trapping of disability. You do at times become the target of unwanted touching, of unwanted interference, and all these different things, and, people staring at you. And so I really didn't want that sort of unwanted attention. And also, I think, I, my narrative about this has completely changed, but at the time, using the white cane to me felt like I some sense of defeat in a way, which sounds really strange, but this notion of I let my vision loss like get the better of me, or I'm somehow weaker because I'm using this. And then of course, once I became trained and more comfortable like just using the cane in public, and once I was able to kind of shed that shame, and just think of it as a tool in my toolbox to help me get around safely, independently, I realized this isn't a sign of weakness, me with this cane. This is a sign of strength. This is the sign of independence. This makes me better and happier and more comfortable and more able to do all the things I want to do on my own terms. And so that took a long time to shift that narrative, but yeah, initially it was I was very afraid of stigma and I had a lot of shame.
Yeah, which is understandable. So back when you were in college, what have you learned now about power, belonging, and identity that you wish you had known when you were 20?
I think exactly what you said in the sense of there is so much power in understanding that you are not alone and that there are others who share your experience who you can build community with. And that's something that was really, really missing for me in that early adult life. But it didn't even occur to me to seek out others like me. I did in a little bit, but not in the sense of like, these are my friends and this is my community. Occasionally, someone would introduce me to another low vision or blind student at my school for advice about practical things. But I never thought, oh, I'm part of a community. I'm part of something bigger than myself, and I think that's really a product. People experience that isolation in a lot of ways because of like the overwhelming kind of still to this day prevalence of the medical model of disability, where it's disability is this individual medical issue that you have to figure out how to deal with it just on your own. And when I met my friend in DC, because our relationship began with this shared interest, as I mentioned, in sports, I attended, she had just launched this organization called the Metro Washington Association of Blind Athletes, and she really wanted me to come tandem biking. She had just started this tandem biking program, where she had recruited all these sighted captains, the people who were on the front of the bike, and all these blind stokers, the people who were in the back of the bike, gotten a bunch of donated tandem bicycles and had set this whole thing up. And, you know, I came, finally, she convinced me to come to one of their events. And that's the first time I realized we were just a bunch of people, sighted, blind, low vision, whatever, but we all just like to bike together. And this was a way that we all could do it safely and in a fun way. And so that was kind of my first taste of disability culture. And I think once you realize that not only are you part of a community when you engage with people with shared lived experience, but that there are shared ways of doing things, shared ways of communicating, culture, all the trappings of culture. I think that is so empowering because not only does it make you feel like, oh, I'm not alone, but it also makes you realize, oh, I have somewhere I can contribute here. I can help other people that come after me. There's a place for me. And I think that is so, so powerful.
Yeah, having that social community, it helped with, it sounds like, uh, creating some internal shifts as well,
Hmm.
which,
Yeah, because it also destigmatizes understanding that something is not disease or defect, but rather culture is inherently destigmatizing, right? Because you're like, no, this is my blind culture, this is my disabled culture. It's not that I'm defective.
mhm. Yeah, that's a great point. What's something you were conditioned to believe about disability, your blindness, that you've now completely unlearned?
um, that it is something to be hidden and not talked about and to feel a sense of shame about. And no one in my family, no one ever made me feel directly made me feel ashamed of having a disability, but rather was the silence around it and oh, we don't talk about this, like, oh, she has like a vision problem. And it was like described as like a problem. And so when someone is kind of pathologizing your situation in that way, it's easy to feel ashamed. Like, I'm a problem. I have a problem. It's a problem. It's not an asset. And like, I think unlearning that notion was really a turning point for me. And not only did I realize that my disability was not a problem, it was, like I said, an asset. It actually there's aspects of who I am as a person that I think are enhanced by my disability and that give me superpowers that like other people don't have, and other people have superpowers that I don't have, and everyone has something to contribute that is valuable. um and that's what makes us, that's important to remember so that we understand like our each other's humanity.
Mhm. Yeah. So earlier we talked about, people, society framing disability as a problem. Do you think society fears disability? If so, what exactly do you think they're afraid of?
That's a great question. And I think that, yes, I do think that people fear disability because as folks often like to say, it's the one kind of identity group that anyone can become a part of at any time. And I think also, you know, people I think people are very afraid of their own mortality. And I think that in their minds, obviously I haven't done sort of like an anthropological, sociological study on this, but I think when people see disability or any kind of health issue or whatnot, it it brings them closer to thinking about that mortality and that vulnerability. And that's scary for people. There's something, I've thought about a lot, which is I feel like of all the sort of sensory disabilities, people seem to have the most fear of blindness more than other things. I've never seen a study about this, but I would be fascinated to dig deeper into that and why sighted people are so deeply attached to their sight. I've talked to so many people who just, oh, it's unimaginable. I cannot imagine living without my sight, or I would harm myself, or I wouldn't want to live if I was blind, like those sorts of things. And it's just really interesting. And I think it would be interesting to kind of explore that further from like kind of a research perspective and think about how we disrupt as a society, how we can help people disrupt those fears, because I think those fears that are often like, usually internally directed affect how they see other people and how they stigmatize other people, how they other people. And I think if we could all feel okay, if we could all live in a universe where we understand that the body and the mind are fallible and we just accept that and we kind of live in that discomfort in a way, but like embrace it, kind of feel okay about it. And it's not a source of like, oh, I'm going to be ostracized, or it doesn't give rise to this mortal terror. I think it would be, we just have such a gentler, kinder world in a lot of ways. And I mean, and that's not to discount, it bears mentioning disability is hard, and it can be, people suffer and experience pain, and like those are not, people should be able to hold that. And, I think disability pride is a complex notion, particularly when, for example, your disability is arising out of violence from the state or from private actors, whether that's being injured in a workplace accident or, you know, experiencing mental health disability as the result of solitary confinement or immigration detention, or there's so many systems that harm and disable people, and that that relationship with disability is very different and problematic. But and I think we need to hold those things too. But as a general matter, I think if we were able to kind of be more gentle with the thinking about the fallibility of the body and the mind, we would be in a better place as a society.
Yeah, those are great points. I think the question of why people are so afraid of being blind or whatever fill in whatever disability it may be, is it's
Mm-hmm.
probably a very complex and layered response and reasoning. Um, so, do you believe the next question we're transitioning to is, do you believe allyship is broken? If so, what are people doing wrong and how can we do better?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I answer it with humility, right? Because I have been on the side of being in community in certain ways as, a disabled woman of color. And I've also been on the side of like being an ally, say, to someone who's LGBTQIA plus, which is not an identity that I hold. Um, and I think it's complex, and I certainly hope that allyship isn't dead, but I do think, of course, allyship needs to come with the direction, the leadership, the centering, the strategic vision of the people with a lived experience themselves. And to me, when I am in those places where I am an ally myself, I'm going to take that lead and not presume that I know exactly how to be an ally in the way that the community needs the most.
Mhm. Being present, showing up, and always learning. So,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah.
if we're honest, who is still being left out of the disability justice movement from your personal? viewpoint.
Yeah, I think this goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. I think that it's certainly a movement. I am a huge subscriber to the principles of disability justice. I have so much respect for Sins Invalid, for disability justice activists like Alice Wong and Mia Mingus, and Sandy Ho, and so many others. I've had many of them on my podcast. And I'm really a believer that disability justice is a frame not only for thinking about how we as a disability community engage with one another, but also like how we can transform the world to be better for everybody. I really do believe that. But I do think it is, as happens in movement spaces, it has its own kind of lingo, its own kind of in crowd. And um, I think that perhaps it'd be really useful to think about how we take the ideas of disability justice and bring them into our day-to-day interactions with people in a way that helps to shift culture. And I think that there's a lot of people working on that, and I think it's absolutely a work in progress. But yeah, like also kind of calling people in, especially like I mentioned earlier, people who may not identify as having a disability, but who are disabled and who, might not know what to ask or what to say or how to participate, and just kind of thinking about how we open the tent to them.
Yeah. And I invisible disabilities come to mind too as you were talking, how to navigate that conversation and merge with people who have visible disabilities, right? And
Yeah.
connecting the dots of how we're on, in many ways, on the same page and can advocate for one another.
Yeah, and that principle of cross disability solidarity really gets at that, right? This notion that we do better when we can converge as much as possible and advocate together as opposed to siloing ourselves into our own little groups.
Mm-hmm. So the next few questions will be regarding systems design and reimagining, with leading off with what's one way the law actually makes things harder for people with disabilities, even when it's supposed to help.
That's a big question. I think, I had a wonderful conversation on my podcast, which is available on in season 10, which is running right now, with Jamelia Morgan, a professor at Northwestern Law School, who runs the Center on Racial and Disability Justice. And I think that she really said it well in the sense of I think the law often treats people with disabilities in very carceral, segregating ways. And that doesn't necessarily, when I say carceral, that doesn't necessarily mean just prisons and jails and detention centers. That could refer to the way we structure home and community-based care, nursing homes, other types of civil commitments or institutions, um, employment, education. There's so many ways in which the law creates the conditions for people with disabilities to be isolated, be ostracized, and to be othered because of their perceived deviance. Um, and I think there's a lot to be done. I mean, of course, there are the disability rights laws that try to address some of this, but um, they're often not enough. And again, I think it's a combination of using the tools of the law, like civil rights law in particular, can help towards liberation, but it's not the end of it. I think we need to really break down this notion of who is deviant and who is not deviant, who is the norm and who is not the norm. And of course, as we know, those things are wrapped up in more than just ableism. They have to do with racism, xenophobia, um, sexist, sexism, and so many other things. So I think it's all kind of like a shared project.
Yeah, those are great points. What does radical accessibility mean to you beyond compliance and check? list. So I'm going to ask that one with a follow-up as well. So if a museum, court, or airport called you tomorrow and asked how to become fully accessible, where would you tell them to start?
Hmm. I I think that accessibility, radical accessibility requires a few things. First is you have to kind of throw all of your assumptions out the window. You need to think about, okay, who who are the users of my space, whether it's digital or physical, and really assess what those users need and what barriers they might face and what their greatest challenges are, and really listen to that feedback and just think about, throw out your compliance checklist and think about, okay, well, if I was a wheelchair user, if I was blind, if I was X, Y, or Z, if I was someone who has light sensitivity or sound sensitivity, what would I need in this space to thrive and to make it through? And just really radically rethink what that design looks like, keeping in mind who is most often excluded. I think when we design for the margins, we design better for everybody. So I think that's the advice I would have, is to and listen to the people who are at the center, who matter the most, who you're going to use whatever the thing is you're designing.
Yeah, that's so key. And then bringing in people who are, bringing them in as well onto the team.
Hmm.
So this section, like relationships,
Hmm.
trust, and emotional labor.
Hmm.
And how has your relationship with your husband taught you more about interdependence or challenge how you thought about how it should look?
Uh, it's interesting that you should ask that. So, yeah, my husband and I met about 5 years ago, and you know, my disability, interestingly, was not something that we like discussed when we first started dating. Like, he didn't ask me a ton of questions about it. It just was, which was really nice in a way. And he has always been very respectful of my desire for independence, and has always been interested in cultivating that, fostering that, encouraging that. Um, and interestingly, a couple of years into our relationship, we were in a bicycle crash, and I broke my collarbone, he broke his wrist. And so we were very interdependent in that moment, because I had a right arm, or no, I had a left arm, he had a right arm. And so together we had to sort of figure that out. And that was a really interesting test of our sense of interdependence. And I think we passed. And unfortunately for my husband, the wrist injury kind of cascaded into all these other things, and he ended up developing some sort of longer term injuries and disabilities in some sense. And so that has really strengthened the importance of interdependence for us as a couple in a lot of ways, because we help each other. And I think, I mean, that should be true of any couple, but sort of in this very visceral physical sense. And so I would say, interdependence has always been a part of how we think about dividing labor in the house and helping each other, and supporting each other physically, mentally, emotionally. And I think it's such a beautiful concept, because it allows you to have autonomy and agency, whilst also recognizing that we all need help sometimes, and that's okay. And it shouldn't be considered negative, or sort of this negative vulnerability.
That's a great point. And that's interesting about how your guys' injury and how you were able to work that out, complement each other with your strengths and weaknesses, even though it was a momentary injury, short term.
For me, it was. For him, it's still kind of, we're still dealing with the ramifications of it. But yeah. Mhm.
So the next question is, do you ever feel like you have to perform quote unquote um, competence or strength to be taken seriously? And how do you let that go when you're tired, if relevant?
I definitely think that is something that I have definitely been challenged with in the sense of always having this feeling that I had to prove someone wrong or to prove that I'm worthy or prove that I'm capable. And that has been in some ways a driver of positive things in my life, but it's also been a source of unnecessary pressure. And one thing about coming into disability identity and understanding disability justice is kind of letting that performative aspect of disability go. Like understanding the sort of narrative of the super crip and why that's really wrong, understanding inspiration porn and why that's problematic, and being okay with being a person who isn't perfect all the time is very liberating. And I think for the most part, I would like to believe that I have let some of that go and just am myself. And especially moments when I feel a sense of not as much energy or fatigue or just not in the mood to perform, it's easier for me to just let myself do that because I don't feel this pressure.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's very common with people in general, but especially those of us with disabilities to feel like we have to overcompensate
Hmm.
in areas of our life. So slight shift, but still related. How do you cope with the emotional toll of having to advocate not just for yourself, but for others on a pretty persistent basis?
It's really hard. It saps a lot of energy, time, resources, and I think that's the piece that makes me sometimes like the angriest is that I have to constantly pay what I like to refer to as a time tax for being disabled. And sometimes that is also with respect to things that are supposed to level the playing field. So, for example, getting like a billion question medical form that I have to then coordinate with my doctor to complete in order to get a reasonable accommodation, even despite the fact that I see my doctor once a year and he is not the expert of my lived experience. I am. And an accommodation is supposed to, for example, in the workplace, is supposed to help equalize you with your peers and help you integrate into the workplace. But how is it equalizing to burden me with all this paperwork just to get something I already know I need and I could just say that I need? And why is that not enough? So I think that, those are just some flaws in kind of how we, in the US at least, have decided to implement civil rights for people with disabilities. And yeah, I find it unbelievably frustrating battling for access. It always requires so many extra steps. And then, of course, the exhaustion of like having to educate people about, okay, why should they do something differently when they've only done it one way before? And why does it matter to make something accessible? It's a lot of burden to carry. Unfortunately, it's necessary, and I find it particularly necessary when I'm doing it on behalf of someone else, even outside of myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I can hear there's a lot of frustration, and I can definitely
Hmm.
relate to the frustration um, as someone who has a disability as well. So, what's a story from the disability community you're still waiting for someone to tell? I'm just going to add that I'm relishing the fact that we got two Asian ladies on the podcast talking about disability advocacy and empowerment.
Yeah, there's so many stories that are untold because people's experiences are so like unique. And something I wish I heard more about is disabled parents of color. Talking about like parenting and disability in and how it intersects with their, other aspects of their identity is something that I haven't seen, a lot of, and would be really interested to hear people talk about. And yeah, absolutely more Asian disability stories from around the world, and also, hearing more stories about South Asians in particular, which is like my cultural background. I'm a huge fan of Peter Torres Fremlin and the Disability Debrief, which is incredibly rich resource and repository of disability stories, news, narratives from all across the globe, that I highly recommend to people. But yeah, I just want more of it across the board. I think that, and also just having the disability perspective, even on like a general type of story, or including that view or that lens in lots of different things, I think would be really valuable, not just in and of itself, but as part of like a broader storytelling and a broader messaging.
Hmm. Well, the wonderful thing about us particularly is that we both host a podcast show where we can bring in those stories, right?
Yeah.
And provide that variety.
Yeah. And that's something I really strive to do. And I know you do very well. I was looking at, some of the guests you've had on, and um, yeah, I try to get as many perspectives as I possibly can.
Yeah. So as we wind down, I wanted to ask a question about, the legacy you want to leave, not just as a lawyer or a podcaster, but as an individual, as a human.
Oh, what a big question. I think that if I leave any legacy at all, which I want it to be that I was someone who was kind to people, who tried to understand people, to hold space for different points of view and different ways of being and thinking. And as someone who helped even just a tiny bit to make it okay for everyone to exist in the world, no matter what their body looks like or does or doesn't do, whatever way their mind works, whoever they love, whatever way they choose to love. And if I can just make a little bit more space for that kind of empathy and kindness and inclusion, then I feel like I would have been successful.
Yeah, I think you're well on your way there, Qudsiya. it,
I hope so.
and leaving that legacy. So
Mhm.
for people who, uh, who I know will love this conversation and want to know more about you, where can they follow you? Where can they follow your podcast, your social media?
Yeah, sure. You can, Down to the Struts is now on LinkedIn. We're also on Instagram. We're a little less active on Instagram because, as I mentioned, I'm not a social media maven. But best spot that you can find all the information related to the podcast is downtothestruts.com, DOWNTOTHESTRUTS.com. And you can also find a link there to sign up for our monthly newsletter on Substack, which is called Getting Down to It.
Awesome, Qudsiya. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed talking to you. I know our topics kind of went all over the place, but you're so eloquent and articulate, and I'm just enamored by the way you speak.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your podcast. Thank you for sharing these stories. I can't wait to listen more to what you have coming next too.